It was October 13, 1943. In the scorched hills of southern Italy, the air hung thick and heavy, carrying the ghosts of summer. It smelled of pulverized stone, of ancient dust stirred by the treads of tanks, and the sweet, bruised scent of olive groves crushed under the boots of advancing armies. On that very morning, a world away in the halls of diplomacy, the Italian government had formally declared war on its former ally, Germany. A pact of iron had fractured into a declaration of betrayal. But for the German soldiers shuffling down a deeply rutted road, their faces hollowed by exhaustion and retreat, that news was a distant echo. The true shock was not a matter of politics. It was hanging from the shoulders of the American infantrymen who now herded them toward captivity. It wasn't the standard rifles or the machine guns mounted on jeeps that held their gaze. It was something else. A squat, heavy weapon, with a handsome wooden stock and a thick drum or box magazine jutting out from its belly. The Thompson submachine gun. The Germans, trained to recognize the clean lines of a Garand, a Springfield, or a Browning, saw this and paused. These were the tools of a serious war, of soldiers. But the Thompson, it felt wrong. It was an absurdity, an object pulled from a different world entirely. Wasn't this the weapon of gangsters? The signature tool of men like Al Capone, of shadowy figures in fedoras spraying bullets into the smoky air of Prohibition speakeasies? To see it here, in the grime-caked hands of grinning American farm boys dressed for combat, felt like a bizarre, cruel joke. But any temptation to laugh died in their throats, silenced by memory. Some among the prisoners had already met this weapon. They had met it in the stone-walled villages of the Liri Valley, where its sound turned alleys into death traps. They had heard it in the twisting mountain passes near Salerno, where its echo bounced between the rocks. They remembered its voice, a deep, stuttering thump that was heavier, angrier than their own MP40s. The German submachine gun spat quick, light bursts of 9mm fire. It was efficient, controlled. This weapon held no mystique. It was not a cinematic prop or a relic of a lawless decade. It was standard issue, a tool that kept him alive in the claustrophobic, life-or-death confines of Italian towns. The irony that his own grandfather might have read about this very gun in the lurid crime headlines of the 1920s was a thought that never crossed his mind. It was simply the thing that worked. Among the Germans, whispers started to circulate, hushed and anxious. They had been taught, conditioned, to see America as an undisciplined nation, its military a clumsy patchwork of Hollywood bravado and industrial arrogance. Yet here, even in the hands of a boyish corporal, the Thompson looked brutally menacing. One prisoner, a veteran of the Eastern Front, muttered that it was a wasteful design. It was too heavy, its range too short, its appetite for ammunition far too greedy. But another man, his uniform torn and stained, quietly reminded him of what they had seen just days before. He spoke of American soldiers firing short, controlled bursts that shattered doorframes into splinters and silenced machine gun nests in a single, deafening roar. Wasteful, perhaps, but devastatingly effective. The story of the Thompson was no accident of war. It had been conceived in the aftermath of the First World War, designed for a singular, brutal purpose: to be a trench broom, a weapon made to sweep dugouts and bunkers clean of enemy soldiers. It arrived too late for that conflict, but its destiny was not to be shelved. Instead, it found a new, notorious life on the streets of America. By the 1930s, newspapers and newsreels had burned its image into the public mind as the gangster's gun, the Chicago typewriter. When the Second World War ignited across the globe, however, the U.S. Army looked past the mythology and rediscovered its brutal utility. By 1943, nearly 1 million had been manufactured and shipped overseas. Here, in the ancient villages of Italy, it was no museum piece. It was a revelation. A German lieutenant, his gray uniform stained with mud and dried sweat, watched the Americans with narrowed, calculating eyes. His mind drifted back to his training in Bavaria, to the sterile lecture halls where polished instructors mocked. American guards lounged by the perimeter, their postures deceptively casual. Their Thompsons were propped against splintered fence posts or rested across their knees, held with an ease that bordered on disrespect. The German soldiers couldn't help but let their eyes drift toward the weapons, and the Americans, noticing their stares, exchanged knowing smirks. One GI gave a slight, almost imperceptible lift of his weapon, a silent gesture that needed no translation. "Yes," it said, "this is real, and yes, you were right to fear it." In that silent, sun-drenched field, perception was undergoing a profound and irreversible shift. What had been dismissed in propaganda as a theatrical oddity, a relic of a decadent culture, was now a grim symbol of American adaptability. The gangster's gun had been reborn, sanctified by the fires of war into a soldier's most trusted ally. It was as though the Americans had somehow bottled the chaotic, untamed energy of their own city streets and unleashed it as a weapon. For the German prisoners, this was not just unnerving, it was fundamentally wrong. It violated the cold logic of war they had been taught to revere. The camera of memory would linger here, fixing on the details that felt both mundane and terrifying. The rough, dark wood of the stock, worn smooth by countless hands. The cold, metallic gleam of the bolt. The thick, heavy magazine, pregnant with .45 caliber rounds. Every component spoke of a design philosophy that defied German engineering principles. Their weapons were born from a doctrine of efficiency and economy. They were light, precise, and built with scarcity in mind. The Thompson was none of those things. It was heavy, clumsy, fantastically expensive, and utterly, undeniably devastating. It embodied a form of excess, an almost sinful extravagance that Germany could not afford, yet America seemed to possess in infinite supply. Years later, interviewed in a prisoner of war camp in the flat plains of Kansas, a former German sergeant would recall that moment with a mixture of awe and simmering bitterness. "We laughed at their wastefulness," he said, his voice quiet. "We called them cowboys." But when Sergeant, a man with tired eyes who had seen too much, later recounted storming a farmhouse outside Salerno. His squad was pinned down, taking fire from upstairs windows, the crack of bullets echoing off the ancient stone walls. He ordered 2 men forward, both armed with Thompsons. They burst through the door, climbed the narrow, rickety staircase, and let loose with short, controlled bursts. The noise, he said, was overwhelming. It was a physical force, a storm of sound and violence that splintered wooden beams and brought plaster raining down from the ceiling. When it was over, the machine gun nest that had held them down was silent. "That's what it was made for," the sergeant said in an interview after the war, his voice flat with memory. "A weapon that says, no second chances." Among the prisoners, stories like this spread like a virus, whispered with a growing sense of dread. The laughter had died. A weapon that seemed almost absurd in theory had become brutally deadly in practice. Their expectations had been shattered by the raw realities of combat, and that betrayal left a wound far deeper than any physical loss. It was a wound to their pride, to the core belief that Germany's discipline and superior efficiency would inevitably outmatch America's apparent recklessness. Statistics would later paint the full picture. By the end of 1943, more than 500,000 Thompsons had been distributed across U.S. forces. They were carried not just by officers and special units,
but by tank crews, engineers, and ordinary paratroopers. The weapon was everywhere. For the Germans, who struggled with constant supply shortages and rationed ammunition, this ubiquity was a stark, suffocating reminder of their enemy's industrial scale. The Thompson was not just a machine gun. It was proof that America could turn even a cultural oddity into a mass-produced reality. By the closing months of 1943, the Thompson submachine gun had become a nearly universal presence among American troops moving through Italy's fractured hills and battered towns. More than 1.5 million of these weapons, sometimes called Tommy guns, trench brooms, or Chicago typewriters, had been stamped from the vast American factories and ferried as
vanished in the rubble of booby-trapped farmhouses. The Thompson's role was clear. It was not a museum piece or a relic of old crime sprees. It was immediate, unforgiving, and direct. A weapon that could win a fight in the space of a single, deafening burst. And yet, for every American who carved his sweetheart's name into the stock or laughed about being a Capone's boy, there were dozens of German prisoners who looked at the Thompson with something close to awe. They whispered that it was wasteful, that it fired too quickly, that no prudent military should arm its men so extravagantly. But what struck them most was abundance. America's war machine could afford to churn out hundreds of thousands of weapons that seemed excessive, even foolhardy. German industry, subject to endless rationing and beset by shortages, could only dream of that level of supply. Every burst from a Thompson was as much a message of industrial supremacy as military strength. In letters home, American infantrymen described the notorious punch of the Tommy gun, how its .45 caliber rounds tore through stone and bone alike, how it could batter down barricades and sweep cellars clean in seconds. The gun's rate of fire was legendary. Early models could spit over 1,000 rounds per minute. Even later, simplified wartime versions still rattled off several hundred shots in the time it took a man to curse and dive for cover. For the ordinary GI, every firefight was a reminder that his country had given him something no enemy could match: overwhelming, relentless firepower in the palm of his hands. But the Thompson's impact wasn't only felt at the front. In the hushed evenings of the German POW camps, perhaps in Kansas, perhaps in some far-flung Italian meadow, the memory of that weapon lingered. Prisoners compared grim notes: a farmhouse stormed, a squad cut down, a machine gun nest silenced before it could even return fire. Some confessed with private shame that they had once believed discipline and efficiency were the only paths to victory. But war had taught them otherwise. America had rewritten the rules, wielding waste as a form of strength, turning abundance of bullets, of steel, of young men into a force that could not be resisted. Cigarettes with the same easy smiles that they slung their Thompsons. Each glance held the same unspoken realization: these soldiers were not movie cowboys, nor careless amateurs. They were the embodiment of a different kind of might, the arrogance and laughter of abundance, the cheerful brutality of a nation that could afford to waste what others cherished. Behind the front, statistics began to circulate. By year's end, the U.S. industry had outproduced every adversary in the field. Over 1.5 million Thompsons rolled from the assembly lines, each a symbol not just of firepower, but of the industrial heart beating behind every squad that crossed an Italian stream or huddled in a rain-soaked foxhole. And for the Germans, humbled and captive, the Thompson was the constantly present reminder that all their old certainties about discipline, about efficiency, about who would shape the fate of this war, were crumbling as surely as the walls battered by American fire. Night after night, they listened to the distant roll of American artillery, the occasional thud of patrol fire,
and remembered the thunder of the Thompson. The weapon mocked them now, no longer a symbol of cartoonish excess, but the very sound of inevitability, a world order rewriting itself, one burst at a time. The long nights in the Italian hills carried a particular kind of silence, one broken only by the distant, rhythmic crash of artillery, or the lonely shuffle of a guard's boots on gravel. In that profound quiet, the German prisoners found themselves lost in memory. They remembered the sounds of battle, the sharp, clean crack of their own Mauser rifles, the rapid chatter of the MG-42, and then, rising above it all, the low, relentless, guttural roar of the Thompson. It was a sound unlike any other on the battlefield. It wasn't precise or elegant. It was a furious, hammering noise that seemed to shake the very foundations of stone walls and rattled the nerves of even the most hardened veterans. An officer, captured in the hellish ruins of Monte Cassino, later admitted to an American interrogator that the first time he heard a squad of Thompsons open up, he mistook the sound for demolition charges tearing a building apart. Only later, when his men
staircase was a potential choke point and every doorway a trap, the Thompson was trusted like an old, reliable friend. Men spoke of it in their letters home as though it possessed a personality. Heavy, stubborn, but loyal, one private wrote. It doesn't let you down, and when it speaks, the other fellow listens. This unique blend of dark humor and grim truth cemented the weapon's place in the American soldier's heart, a bond that went far beyond its mechanical function. For the Germans, however, it was no laughing matter. At Anzio, night patrols flinched at the mere echo of its distinctive bark carrying across the dunes. During the vicious street fighting in Naples, civilians would later recall how the American submachine guns filled the darkness with a roar so constant, so overwhelming, that it seemed impossible for anyone to survive within its reach. The Thompson became more than a tool of battle. It became a presence, a specter that clung to the memory long after the shooting had stopped. By 1944, the Thompson was already beginning to give way to the M3 grease gun, a cheaper, simpler weapon designed for mass production. But in the long and brutal Italian campaign, the Thompson still reigned supreme. Its distinctive silhouette, the solid wooden stock, the heavy barrel, and the thick magazine, was a familiar and feared sight against the horizon. In its own way, it represented the last gasp of an older era of weapon design, one where craftsmanship and brute force were valued over pure economy. But this was a war where, for America at least, economy mattered less than for anyone else, and the Germans understood this all too well. For them, every round of ammunition was precious, every weapon a carefully guarded asset, every tank the result of a painful calculation between desperate need and crippling scarcity. The Americans, it seemed, were free from these chains. The Thompson, more than any other weapon, became the symbol of that freedom, a visible, audible reminder that America's strength lay not only in its soldiers, but in its seemingly bottomless industrial reserve. To fight against that was to fight not just men, but the crushing weight of an entire world of production. One captured lieutenant, reflecting on his experience years later, other machines, other symbols of power waiting to step onto the world stage. What they had seen in those dusty Italian villages was not the full measure of their opponent, but merely the first dark shadow of a storm still gathering on the horizon. The image was unforgettable. The American soldier, casual and confident, with a gangster's gun slung at his side, ready to rewrite the rules of war with every thunderous burst.